While diplomatic meetings dominate headlines and phone calls between world leaders capture attention, a silent transformation is unfolding across Europe. This isn't about military invasions or political scandals. This is about something far more fundamental: the systematic restructuring of how an entire continent powers itself, heats its homes, and runs its industries. Russia's energy strategy isn't just about Ukraine. It's about reshaping the economic and political architecture of Europe for decades to come. And what's remarkable is how few people are discussing the full scope of what's actually happening. To understand the present moment, we need to go back to a decision that seemed almost inevitable at the time: Europe's deepening dependence on Russian energy throughout the 2000s and 2010s. After the Cold War ended, European leaders faced a choice. They could diversify their energy sources, investing heavily in renewable infrastructure, nuclear power, and liquefied natural gas terminals. Or they could take what appeared to be the economically rational path: cheap, abundant natural gas flowing through pipelines from Russia. Germany, Europe's largest economy and industrial powerhouse, led this transformation. By 2021, Russia supplied approximately 55% of Germany's natural gas imports. The Nord Stream pipeline, running directly from Russia to Germany beneath the Baltic Sea, became a symbol of this energy partnership. German political and business leaders argued this interdependence would create stability. The logic was straightforward: economic integration would make conflict irrational for both sides. But this logic rested on a fundamental assumption that Russia would prioritize economic benefit over geopolitical ambition. That assumption, we now know, was flawed. When Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022, European leaders suddenly confronted the strategic vulnerability they had spent decades creating. Natural gas supplies that heated homes, powered factories, and generated electricity were now controlled by a hostile power willing to use energy as a weapon. The immediate response was dramatic. The European Union committed to reducing Russian gas imports by 2/3 within a single year. Germany accelerated plans to build LNG terminals. Countries scrambled to sign contracts with alternative suppliers in Qatar, the United States, and Norway. But here's what's crucial to understand: this wasn't just a temporary disruption that Europe could quickly overcome. This was the beginning of a structural transformation that will define European energy policy, industrial competitiveness, and geopolitical positioning for the next generation. Let's examine exactly how Russia has wielded energy as a strategic weapon, because the tactics are more sophisticated than simple supply cutoffs. In the summer of 2022, Russia began reducing gas flows through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. The stated reasons changed: scheduled maintenance, technical problems with turbines, equipment that needed repair. But the pattern was unmistakable. Each reduction came at strategically calculated moments, often coinciding with political tensions or diplomatic pressure. By September 2022, Nord Stream 1 was operating at just 20% capacity. Then came the mysterious explosions that damaged both Nord Stream pipelines, an act of sabotage whose perpetrators remain officially unidentified, though investigations continue. The timing of these reductions maximized European vulnerability. Russia decreased flows during late summer and autumn, precisely when countries needed to fill storage facilities before winter. German storage facilities, which typically reached 95% capacity by October, sat at barely 75% in October 2022, creating a political crisis in Europe's wealthiest nation. But Russia's energy strategy extended far beyond pipeline politics. Consider the broader mechanisms. First, price manipulation. By controlling supply volumes, Russia could influence European natural gas prices, creating economic pressure that rippled through industries and households. In August 2022, European gas futures reached €340 per megawatt-hour, compared to typical prices of €20–30 before the crisis. The European gas market operates on marginal pricing, where the most expensive supply unit sets the price for all gas consumed. This meant heating costs for households increased 4 to 5 times, while industrial users faced catastrophic impacts. Fertilizer plants across Europe shut down because production became economically unviable, demonstrating how energy prices cascade through every economic sector. Second, targeted pressure on specific countries. Russia could reduce supplies to nations taking stronger positions on Ukraine while maintaining flows to those showing more flexibility. This created divisions within the European Union, as countries with different dependency levels faced different incentives. Third, long-term contracts as political tools. Many European utilities had signed 10 to 20-year contracts with Gazprom at favorable rates. Breaking these contracts carried financial penalties and legal complications, creating institutional resistance to rapid diversification. Fourth, infrastructure leverage. Europe's gas storage facilities, pipeline networks, and distribution systems had been built around the assumption of Russian supply. Redirecting these systems required not just different contracts, but physical infrastructure changes costing billions of euros. Natural gas infrastructure isn't fungible. Pipeline gas from Russia flows at specific pressures. LNG from overseas requires regasification terminals. Germany had 0 LNG terminals before the crisis and built floating facilities in months by declaring emergencies and bypassing regulations. These emergency solutions are more expensive to operate and represent stopgap measures rather than optimal long-term infrastructure. What makes this strategy particularly effective is its asymmetry. Russia exports approximately 40% of its federal budget revenue from oil and gas. Losing European markets hurts, but Europe imported roughly 40% of its total gas consumption from Russia before the war. The pain is mutual, but Europe's immediate vulnerability, keeping homes heated through winter, keeping factories running, created more acute political pressure. Russia calculated correctly that this asymmetry would limit Europe's response options. And they were partially right. The European response to this energy warfare has been remarkable in some ways and deeply problematic in others. Let's examine both dimensions honestly. On the positive side, Europe achieved something most analysts thought impossible. In 2022, the EU reduced Russian pipeline gas imports by approximately 80% compared to 2021 levels. Germany built 4 floating LNG terminals in less than a year, infrastructure projects that would normally require 5 years of planning and environmental review. Countries like Poland and the Baltic states, which had long warned about Russian energy dependence, accelerated their complete disconnection from Russian supply. Spain and Portugal, with existing LNG infrastructure, became critical energy hubs redistributing imports across Europe. Renewable energy deployment accelerated dramatically. Solar panel installations reached record levels. Wind power capacity expanded. The crisis became a catalyst for the green energy transition that had been moving slowly for years. But beneath these achievements lie deeper contradictions and unresolved problems. First, Europe didn't actually stop buying Russian energy. It just changed the delivery method. Russian LNG imports to Europe actually increased in 2023. Ships carrying liquefied natural gas from Russian Arctic terminals docked at European ports, while politicians declared independence from Russian pipeline gas. The distinction became semantic rather than strategic. Second, the replacement supplies came at enormous cost. European industries suddenly faced energy prices 3 to 4 times higher than their American or Asian competitors. Energy-intensive manufacturing, chemicals, steel, aluminum, glass, became economically unviable in Europe. Companies began relocating production to regions with cheaper energy. Germany, Europe's industrial engine, provides the clearest example. BASF, the world's largest chemical company, announced in 2023 it would permanently reduce European production and shift investment to China and the United States. The company's Ludwigshafen facility consumes as much natural gas annually as Switzerland. When gas prices quadrupled, BASF cut output by 30%, with some reductions permanent. Similar patterns emerged across energy-intensive sectors. ArcelorMittal reduced steel production. Yara closed fertilizer plants. Aluminum smelters shut down. The economic logic is brutal. If European electricity costs 3 times what it costs elsewhere, European facilities cannot compete. Once specialized facilities close and workforces disperse, restarting becomes exponentially difficult. This creates a reinforcing cycle. As energy-intensive industries close, the industrial ecosystem supporting them contracts. Europe loses not just jobs, but knowledge, innovation capacity, and strategic industrial capability, creating long-term implications beyond immediate economic losses. This represents not a temporary adjustment, but a permanent loss of industrial capacity. Once chemical plants close and supply chains relocate, they don't simply return when conditions improve. The infrastructure, expertise, and market relationships move to new locations. Third, the coal comeback. With natural gas scarce and expensive, European countries reopened coal power plants they had planned to close. Germany brought coal plants out of reserve. Italy increased coal generation. The Netherlands delayed coal phase-outs. This directly contradicted Europe's climate commitments and increased carbon emissions. Fourth, the dependency didn't disappear. It just shifted. Instead of depending on Russian pipelines, Europe now depends on LNG supplies from Qatar, the United States, and other sources. These suppliers are more politically aligned with Europe, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. Energy security requires domestic production or genuine diversification across many sources. Europe achieved neither. Fifth, the political fragmentation. Hungary continued importing Russian gas throughout the crisis. Austria maintained its long-term Gazprom contracts. Individual countries made bilateral deals that sometimes contradicted EU-wide strategies. The unified European response that officials proclaimed publicly masked significant divisions privately. To understand where this situation leads, we need to examine Putin's actual strategic objectives, not the stated goals in official speeches, but the revealed preferences shown through actions. Many Western analysts initially believed Russia's energy weapon would quickly become ineffective. The logic seemed sound. Europe would find alternative suppliers, Russia would lose its primary customer, and Moscow would face economic collapse forcing policy changes. But this analysis misunderstood Putin's timeline and objectives. The Soviet collapse in the 1980s, partly due to low oil prices, taught Russian leadership that economic interdependence with the West could be weaponized against Russia. Putin spent 2 decades building financial buffers, accumulating over $600 billion in foreign reserves and reducing import dependence. These weren't random choices, but systematic preparation for economic confrontation. First, Putin isn't optimizing for maximum revenue. He's optimizing for strategic leverage. Russia can accept lower energy revenues if it means Europe faces permanent industrial decline and increased dependence on alternative suppliers that Russia can influence indirectly. Consider the mechanism. If European energy prices remain structurally higher than competitor regions, European industrial capacity permanently migrates to Asia and North America. This weakens Europe economically, reduces its geopolitical influence, and creates divisions between European allies and the United States. Second, Putin understands that energy infrastructure operates on decade-long timescales. The decisions Europe makes today, which LNG terminals to build, which pipeline routes to establish, which suppliers to contract with, will determine energy flows for the next 20 to 30 years. By disrupting the previous system, Russia forced Europe into rapid decisions made under crisis conditions. These rushed choices often favor immediate supply security over long-term optimization, creating inefficiencies and vulnerabilities that will persist for years. Third, the strategy creates leverage points with non-European actors. India and China dramatically increased their Russian energy imports after Europe reduced purchases. Russia now redirects oil and gas eastward at discounted prices, cementing economic relationships with the world's 2 most populous nations. This matters because it creates a bloc of countries with economic incentives to maintain relationships with Russia, regardless of Western sanctions. When European and American officials pressure India or China on Russia policy, those countries can point to their energy security needs as justification for continued trade. Fourth, domestic Russian politics. The energy confrontation with Europe serves Putin's narrative that Russia faces existential threats from the West and must be willing to accept economic hardship to maintain independence. The policy creates the siege mentality that justifies authoritarian control. Fifth, the Belarus and Turkey angles. Russian gas still flows to Europe through pipelines crossing Belarus and Turkey. This gives those countries leverage as intermediaries who can theoretically block or redirect flows. Russia accepts this shared leverage because it complicates European policy and creates additional relationships Moscow can influence. What we're seeing isn't a simple economic exchange where Russia sells energy and Europe buys it. We're seeing strategic positioning for a multipolar world where energy flows determine political alignments. This European energy crisis doesn't stay contained within Europe. It's triggering a global reconfiguration of energy markets with implications that extend far beyond Russia and the European Union. Start with the United States. American LNG exports to Europe increased by over 140% in 2022 compared to pre-crisis levels. The U.S. became Europe's largest LNG supplier, displacing Russia. This creates stronger transatlantic energy ties, but also raises questions about American reliability as a supplier. U.S. natural gas is primarily produced through fracking in shale formations. This production can scale up or down based on prices and political conditions. What happens if a future American administration decides to limit LNG exports to keep domestic prices low? Europe would face another supply crisis, this time with even fewer alternatives. The infrastructure investments being made now, LNG terminals, regasification facilities, pipeline connections, assume long-term American supply. If that assumption proves incorrect, Europe will have built expensive infrastructure that cannot fulfill its intended purpose. Now consider the Middle East. Qatar emerged as a critical supplier to Europe, but Qatari gas production operates under different constraints than Russian pipeline gas. Qatar's production capacity is limited by its offshore gas fields and the time required to expand liquefaction facilities. Scaling up supply requires years of investment and billions of dollars in infrastructure. This means European demand pushed global LNG prices higher, creating ripple effects in Asia. Countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, which relied on spot market LNG purchases, suddenly couldn't afford supplies. This led to electricity blackouts in South Asian nations that had nothing to do with the Ukraine conflict, but suffered consequences from Europe's energy crisis. China's position deserves particular attention. Chinese companies signed long-term contracts to purchase Russian gas at significant discounts compared to global market prices. This gives Chinese industries a structural cost advantage over European competitors in energy-intensive manufacturing. If a Chinese chemical plant pays 40% less for natural gas than a German chemical plant, the Chinese facility can profitably produce products the German facility cannot. This isn't a temporary market fluctuation. It's a permanent shift in industrial competitiveness that will reshape global manufacturing patterns. Africa enters this picture in complex ways. European countries that previously showed limited interest in African gas development suddenly became eager to partner on new projects in Nigeria, Mozambique, Senegal, and other nations with gas reserves. This could accelerate African energy development, bringing economic benefits to countries that desperately need them. But it also raises questions about whether these partnerships respect African interests or simply replicate extractive colonial patterns under new names. Who will these gas resources primarily benefit? African populations or European industries? The climate implications cannot be ignored. The global rush to secure fossil fuel supplies directly contradicts the commitments made at COP26 and subsequent climate conferences. Countries that pledged to reduce emissions rapidly expanded fossil fuel infrastructure in response to the energy crisis. LNG, while cleaner than coal, still produces significant carbon emissions. The new terminals, pipelines, and shipping routes being built will operate for 30 to 40 years, locking in fossil fuel use through mid-century. This makes the 1.5-degree warming target increasingly unrealistic. Renewable energy advocates argue the crisis should have accelerated the transition to wind, solar, and other clean sources. And to some degree it did. Renewable deployment increased. But the immediate need for firm, dispatchable power that can replace Russian gas meant most countries turned to other fossil fuels rather than waiting for renewable capacity to scale. Looking ahead, several scenarios appear possible. None of them suggest a simple return to the pre-2022 status quo. Scenario 1. Europe achieves genuine energy independence through massive renewable deployment and domestic production. Solar and wind capacity increases so dramatically that fossil fuel imports become supplementary rather than essential. This requires unprecedented investment and political will, but it's technically feasible. The obstacles are primarily political and economic rather than technological. Can European societies accept the landscape changes from massive wind farms? Can governments sustain the subsidies required to make renewable energy economically viable at scale? Can grid infrastructure handle the intermittency challenges of renewable power? Germany's experience suggests the difficulty. Despite massive renewable investment, Germany still relies on natural gas for industrial processes and backup power. Fully replacing that would require not just more solar panels and wind turbines, but fundamental changes to industrial processes and energy storage systems. Scenario 2. Europe accepts permanent economic restructuring. Energy-intensive industries relocate to regions with cheaper power. Europe focuses on high-value manufacturing and services that don't require massive energy inputs. The continent becomes primarily a consumer market rather than an industrial producer. This scenario implies significant job losses in traditional manufacturing sectors and increased dependence on imports for basic materials. It means accepting a diminished role in global manufacturing and the geopolitical influence that comes with industrial capacity. Scenario 3. Gradual Russian reintegration. If the Ukraine conflict eventually reaches some form of resolution, economic pressure to restore cheaper energy supplies could lead to partial restoration of Russian gas imports. This wouldn't mean returning to previous dependency levels, but it might mean accepting that Russian energy plays some role in Europe's mix. This scenario faces enormous political obstacles. European populations and governments that saw Russia use energy as a weapon would resist recreating that vulnerability. But economic pressures, particularly if energy costs remain structurally high, could gradually overcome that resistance. Scenario 4. A truly multipolar energy system. Europe successfully diversifies across many suppliers: US LNG, Middle Eastern gas, African resources, Norwegian production, renewable generation, so that no single source creates strategic vulnerability. This resembles the approach countries like Japan have taken, deliberately avoiding excessive dependence on any single supplier. Achieving this requires sustained political commitment and willingness to accept higher costs for security. It means sometimes purchasing more expensive energy from diverse sources, rather than optimizing for lowest price from a single supplier. What seems clear is that the old model, cheap Russian pipeline gas as the foundation of European industrial competitiveness, is permanently broken. Whether what replaces it proves more resilient or simply creates different vulnerabilities remains to be seen. For Russia, the long-term consequences are equally uncertain. Redirecting energy exports from Europe to Asia requires massive infrastructure investment in pipelines, ports, and liquefaction facilities. China and India, knowing Russia's limited alternatives, negotiate hard on prices. Russia may find that replacing European customers isn't as simple as redirecting flows eastward. The geopolitical implications extend beyond energy markets. Europe's economic weakening relative to Asia and North America shifts global power balances. If European countries face prolonged economic stagnation due to high energy costs, their ability to maintain military spending, development aid, and diplomatic influence diminishes accordingly. The climate crisis adds urgency to all these questions. Every year spent building new fossil fuel infrastructure is a year not spent building the renewable systems we ultimately need. The energy crisis created by Russia's strategy might accelerate the clean energy transition, or it might delay it by decades by locking in new fossil fuel dependencies. The silent war over European energy continues far from television cameras and diplomatic summits. While leaders discuss ceasefires and peace proposals, the real restructuring of power is happening in pipeline negotiations, LNG terminal construction, and industrial relocation decisions. This isn't a crisis that will resolve quickly. The choices being made today by governments, companies, and international organizations will determine European prosperity and global power dynamics for the next generation. What's being reshaped isn't just energy policy, it's the fundamental architecture of how industrial civilization operates in the 21st century. And the outcome remains deeply uncertain.